Today's World Insight. Leaders converge on Glasgow for the COP26 conference. Will this climate summit clinch a deal that eluded previous meetings? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. The 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, also known as COP26, is scheduled to take place from October the 31st to November the 12th in Glasgow, Scotland. The conference brings together the governments worldwide to coordinate on tackling climate change.
Ahead of the COP26 summit, China and the U.S. have been ironing out their progress and pledges to achieving carbon neutrality. At a press conference, China's Vice Minister of Ecology and Environment, Ye Min, highlighted China's effort to fulfilling their commitments to the Paris Agreement and aiding developing countries in this regard.
China hopes that we can address some problems in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We also hope that we can make progress in providing the capital and technology, and promote capacity building, which are the developing countries' main concerns.
U.S. Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry delivered remarks in London, outlining the voices from Washington.
Now, we must significantly accelerate our efforts. That is a judgment not of me, or President Biden, or of anybody in politics. It's the judgment of the best science and mathematics.
China, for its part, has put its global environmental commitments into action. Earlier in September, China pledged not to build any more coal-fired power projects overseas in a bid to halt climate change and promote green, low-carbon development. Recently, the country also submitted a renewed emission-cutting plan to the United Nations. The plan reiterates China's targets of peaking carbon emissions by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. To better fulfill the commitments, China will slash emissions intensity by 65% and increase the proportion of non-fossil fuel use in primary energy consumption to 25%, higher than the previous pledge of 20%. The plan also commits to raising the installed capacity of wind and solar power to over 1.2 billion kilowatts by 2030.
The world is watching. For more on the upcoming COP26 conference in Glasgow, we are joined in Boston by John Sturman, who is a professor from MIT. Joining us in Beijing, Guan Dabo from Tsinghua University. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. First of all, everybody is watching. Every climate change conference is a fight, to say the least. We had some failures, but hopefully we're going to have some success. How much success do you think, Professor Sturman, you're having in mind for Glasgow?
Well, so thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Good to see you.
I don't think it's what I'm expecting as much as we need to focus on what is needed. And what is needed is a dramatic increase in the amount of emissions reductions as soon as possible. And what nations need to understand, the United States, China, India, every nation in the world needs to understand that unless we can cut global emissions by about half by 2030 and then reach net zero by about mid-century, every single nation, including the United States and including China, will suffer great economic and other harms. This is something we must avoid. And that is the challenge.
So, Professor Sturman, instead of telling me exactly what your expectations are for Glasgow, you're telling me about the necessity to be successful and urgent. But you did not seem to have much hope about this round of political talk. Do you?
Well, I wouldn't say that. What I'd say is the the conference is about to happen, and we shouldn't ratchet down our expectations.
All right.
Instead, what people need to do is understand that it's not a question of letting other nations cut while certain nations continue to use fossil fuels, because everybody will suffer. Just to illustrate this, I shared with your team an image of what our model, what our analysis shows is likely to happen to Shanghai by the year 2100 in terms of sea level rise.
Before that happens, already a lot of other countries will already go underwater, as we know, particularly those island nations.
And so,
having said that, though, let me go to you, Professor Guan, on that as well. How much hope do you have for Glasgow meeting, a political meeting of political leaders?
Well, I think it's already a great success. Everyone and almost all the countries in the world agree that climate change is an urgent task. Everybody needs to do. And I think the biggest expectation I would see that is the U.S., China, and the EU can finally work together, possibly one of the most successful ones, to jointly lead the global climate change mitigations, especially helping the developing country to decelerate and then to possibly alleviate the emissions in next few decades. And I think that is the biggest sort of the success I would like to see. And more important is that we, as a developed country in the U.S. and EU, possibly together with China, need to help the developing countries because they are the growing ones emissionally, and then they are determining the future, the performance of the future climate change mitigation.
Both of you talk about the urgency. Let's see the realities of the urgency, because aspiration is one thing. Real action is another thing. So let's take a look at the real actions being taken so far. Governments will be in spotlight, as we know, at the COP26 conference to meet a deadline of this year to commit to more ambitious pledges in what could be the last chance to put the world on track to limit the Earth's warming to within 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and ideally to 1.5 degrees. According to, though, the new emissions gap report by the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, G20 countries as a whole, which represent 80% of the global emissions, are not on track to achieve their original or new 2030 pledges. That includes both the emerging economies and the developed countries, the G20, as we talk about. So there seems to be a lot of urgency. So let's talk about some of the issues specific. Since we are doing this program from CGTN, the headquarters in Beijing, I'm sure everybody watching this program is saying, it's the host trying to hide away from the most important topic, which is the fossil fuel used by China, the coal issue. No, I'm not going to do that. So let's focus on that. Professor Guan, tell me more about what exactly is China's current stage of using coal. Why does China still need to use coal to a certain extent? What is China's goal of cutting the fossil fuels by the year 2025? Because Glasgow is about setting the goals for every 5 years, right? So let's talk about the first 5 years, because without talking about first 5 years, you will never be able to talk about 2030, not even mention 2050 and 2060. I'm already talking too much. Professor Guan, go ahead.
Yeah, obviously China is the largest coal consumption country in the world. There's no doubt. But this is from the historical reasons. And China has already put a huge effort since 2010, well, possibly starting with 2005 already. And since 2010, actually Chinese coal consumption is starting to go down. And in recent few years, it's been quite a rapidly drop of the total coal consumptions. But the thing is that we have many coal power plants. Those infrastructures is like in many coal power plants in US and in Europe. You can't just ease them off overnight. This is a time first is phase out and then to find the appropriate replaceable fuels. And then the coal consumption decline in China is gonna happen in the next 5 years. It's gonna have a significant drop.
What is a significant drop? What is the number we're talking about here?
Well, in the next 5 years, I think we are talking about between 6 to 8% of the overall drop, maybe around, if we do really well, it's about 10% in 5 years time. We can drop the total volume of the coal by around 10%. It's already a lot of the emissions if you translate it into an emission equivalent. And but on the other hand, we actually had many renewable. We will have a lot of, well, we already have a lot of renewable energy installed, and the renewable energy. If you can have a look at the newly added capacities in China in the recent 5 years, majority part is renewable energies, and they will happen. It's gonna accelerate even further in the next 5-10 years. So that's why China is making a new commitment, or like a further commitment, to add 1,200 gigawatts of the solar and the wind by 2030, which is a lot more than many countries as a whole, and a lot more ambitious.
By 2050 and 2060, what exactly is the goal? Non-fossil fuel.
Well, from my personal perspective, I don't think China would entirely remove coal even by 2060. There's no need to do that because
What is the number? There's a number there, according to the latest report put out by the NDRC.
The numbers I don't have in my top of my head, but I
about
think it's
80%, if I could, just for your information. Let me go to you, Professor Sturman. Yeah. Tell me more about how do you see, the quote-unquote last century question for the developed economies, because it was the last century that's the industrialized economies that polluted more with fossil fuels. And now they phased out most of them. But now facing the developing countries, emerging economies, it's a big task.
So that's absolutely right. And historically, the UN negotiation process has recognized what's known as common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea there being that the developed nations became developed using fossil fuels, and that the developing and emerging nations, including China, India, and so forth, needed to be able to burn fossil fuels to develop. This does not work anymore. It's impossible. If emissions from the developed nations all could magically fall to zero today, but the developing nations, including China and so forth, keep using fossil fuels, even according to their nationally determined contributions, then the consequences of the global warming that would result will destroy their economies. And as you can see in the slides that I've shared, Shanghai would disappear, Shenzhen would disappear, and that's just sea level rise, crop yield decline, forced migration of climate refugees, disease,
right.
Extreme heat.
We all know the consequences, but now is the thing.
So what needs to happen,
yeah, go ahead,
needs to happen is the developed nations and other very wealthy nations, and China is largely now entering that realm, they need to provide the technical assistance and the resources to help the other developing nations leapfrog the carbon economy and go straight to
We're not talking about
economy.
Ideal situation, sir. What are they providing? That is the question. Earlier pledge, Paris Agreement. Developed economies already pledged to the least developed countries with huge amount of, or certain amount of support. Until today, that money is not on the table at all. And that became another topic for this year's Glasgow meeting. So people are wondering, when will these commitments be fulfilled? Well, the coal issue is being emphasized. What about the financial issue?
So completely right. The world has fallen short on the pledges and promises to provide that financial assistance to the developing world. But I
think
not
the world, but rather the countries. We should name those countries who have failed. Who are those countries? Tell us more about that.
Essentially, every developed country in the world has not fulfilled the goal of $100 billion per year of assistance to the developing world, which was supposed to be implemented by 2020. So it's everybody. Pointing fingers here doesn't really work.
Pointing finger is very important now if it leads to real implementation. So now the world is pointing finger to China, say fossil fuel. Now China already got the plan about 2025, 2030, 2050, 2060. So what about those that are should be putting money on the table for the least developed economies? When are they going to be fulfilling their missions? and wonder whether fingers should be pointing to them at the same time, naming their names so that they would fulfill their responsibilities. It doesn't mean if a group does not,
developed countries.
Well, if it's being said in that way, nobody is going to do anything unless they're being named one by one. So hiding in a group doesn't help the problem.
All the developed countries, every country in the EU, the United States, Australia, Japan, and China all have to simultaneously cut their emissions and provide the resources to the developing world to leapfrog the carbon economy and go straight to a renewable-based, low-carbon, zero-carbon economy.
All right, Professor
And this includes China, too.
Professor Guan, respond.
Right. I think there's a couple of things here. Finance is one thing, but another thing is, well, just response to the coal consumption. I don't really think the coal consumption does really matters a lot, especially when the China uses a lot of coal and is being using the cleanest coal power plants in the world. As long as we have negative emission technologies or the net zero emission technologies such as CCUS, carbon capture and utilization storage, and many other kind of hydrogens, making use of those key technologies. The key problem for those implementing those technologies cheaply is that it's not saying those technologies is not mature. Many of them are not mature, but many of them they are already mature. They are ready to commercialization. And it's only a few key parts, a very expensive part holding in developed countries, well, in Europe and the US. They are actually not be able to deployment in a large scale to a massive scale. Therefore, there's no scale effect to bring the price down.
All right.
So as long as we have those key components massively produced, then we have those technology cheap enough using fossil fuel as together with the negative emission technologies is not issues.
Professor,
so I think,
on that point, let me have Professor Sturman to respond. Technology transfer,
So,
making it cheaper for the developing countries.
Right. So the coal CCS, CCUS is an interesting possibility, but it's not yet deployable at scale. And in the meantime, if all the countries using coal today, including China, but also all other countries who do, continue to do so, then it's quite frankly going to be too late. We have to cut emissions globally by about half by 2030. It takes too long to develop these technologies to scale. So the most important thing that needs to be done, and China is making terrific progress here with the new revised, updated, nationally determined contribution that was just issued yesterday, and which I've read over. China's increased its ambition here. And the most important part of that is to expand and tighten the carbon market that China is now rolling out. The price of carbon in that market right now is 20 to 70 yuan, and that's about $3 to $10 US.
All right.
This is a great development, and China needs to be congratulated for bringing that market into being. It needs to be a much, much higher price, however, in order to stimulate the innovation that my colleague from Tsinghua is referring to. And having a higher price on carbon across all economies in China, in the United States, in the EU, everywhere, is going to unleash terrific innovation in ways we don't even understand are possible yet.
Professor,
and that's one of the most important things we can do here.
I understand you and your colleagues are looking at the world from one perspective, and it's a very crucial perspective about how we're going to coexist with our Earth. However, on the other hand, there are issues that have been very crucial in every climate change conference and remains in Glasgow as well. The common but differentiated responsibilities. One could not just brush off and say, now everybody is on the same line. It's not. Because the developed economies over the past 100 years in this industrial revolution have already polluted the world and also contributed to global warming before the developing countries even started using the industrial methods. So how about that part? That is very crucial. We cannot just talk as if we are living in a vacuum. We are not. So that is the issue that I think, how should we balance that with the ambitious goal the world should have together?
So I completely agree with the point that the developed nations used fossil fuels to develop, and it is unfair to deny opportunities for development for those nations that are on the cusp of that. But here's the reality. Even if all carbon emissions from all developed countries went to zero today, if the developing nations continue to use fossil fuels, then they are going to suffer.
But
Your
we are
country
not talking
will
about
lose
the
its most
developed
important
economies
city.
went to zero
Well,
in terms of
please.
fossil fuel. Hold on. Let me just
Let's finish,
continue
please.
about that because we're going to another path, the same path. What I'm talking about, the developed countries helping the developing countries so that they will not have to go on the same road. We talk about technology transfer. We talk about reduction of the technology prices. And we talk about international cooperation. We are not seeing that. We are not seeing financial support for the developing countries either. So I'm not talking about something else or somebody else. I'm talking about what about the commitment being already made? Where are they?
So this is what has to change, right? Everybody is looking at this from a zero-sum mentality that you need to cut your emissions, we get to continue to burn fossil fuels. That needs to change, and people need to understand that they, in their own nations, wherever that is, in the United States, in Europe, in China, are going to suffer, and not in the distant future, but now. You had 71 people drowning in the subway in China, and we had people drowning in New York City in recent storms that were amplified by climate change.
Once again, we know the necessity, but the question is about how. Let's figure out the how, because if we talk about the ambitions, it will always be talk. We are not talking about the talk. We are talking about walking the talk. That's the most important thing. So, Professor Guan, please come in and also offer your solutions. I'm talking about solutions, once again, not ambitions only.
Right, okay. I think there's a number of approach in terms of the solutions. First of all, I think the developed countries like Europe and the US need to do more. Not like say only then they commit to carbon neutrality around the middle of the century. They're possibly not enough. And I think what they should be more responsible is that they should do negative emission growth than to accommodate amount of the carbon space required by the developing countries. And yeah, I think that is the way to be responsible for doing that. So I think that the current commitment by the US and the EU can be a lot more enhanced in the next few years, depending on this as long as there's a stability, climate political stability issues is there. So, for example, US is continue to lead the climate change jointly with the EU and China, rather than fall apart in a few years' time.
Right.
I think that is the political part. But for the other type of solutions, technology, innovations, deployment, demonstration is certainly a way forward. We can't just say that it's still in the lab. It's a lot of the mature technology already in place, and there's ready to. Well, there's a lot of long, like a decades already for pilot demonstration for CCUS, and it's those negative emission growth technologies are ready to deploy worldwide, including China, including India, and many other developing countries. Only thing is that China will need to work with the other developing countries to do the capacity buildings and to decelerate and then to kind of flatten the emission growth curve. Nevertheless, yeah. Okay.
There are a lot of things going on in our world. Certainly, the fundamental issue both of you have illustrated already clearly. But there are geopolitics. There are issues like a pandemic. There are things about the economic recovery and the political uncertainties. So it seems that political leaders are trying to prioritize and trying to juggle all of these goals on their hands. But at the same time, we see the technology is already developing. We see the public already calling for more actions, real actions, and they're asking the business community, they're asking politicians to do the same. So how do we see all of these factors mixed up in a way at this very crucial moment, Professor Sturman?
So the role of public opinion and the role of the public's demand for action on this issue that threatens our prosperity, our health, and our lives is critical. But I wanted to come back to the technology issue. We already have most everything we need to make a difference on this issue today. So just to give you an example, I'm speaking to you from my home outside Boston, Massachusetts. It's about 90 years old. And a few years ago, we did a deep energy retrofit here. All ready to go, mature technologies, lots of insulation, good quality windows, solar on the roof, high efficiency appliances, et cetera. And over the past 6 years since we've done this, we have made more than 40% more energy than we use with no fossil fuels whatsoever. So my house is now a power plant. This was quite affordable and actually has already paid off. And this is something that could be done around the world. Efficiency is the fastest, safest, and cheapest way we can bend the emissions curve right now.
Professor Sturman, I want to congratulate you and your family for that. It's a great contribution, first of all. But on the other hand, can what you have already powered, for example, from your house, eventually come into the overall electricity supply of your country? In other words, is infrastructure ready? You know, each house could be a power plant, but is infrastructure ready to link everybody together quickly from you?
We're making progress, but we have a long way to go. We're going to need to build storage. We're going to need to have high voltage DC transmission to bring the power from where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to where it's needed. And we're going to need regulatory reform for our electric generation and utilities to be able to implement this quickly. Things are happening. They need to happen faster here in this country and around the world.
Is exactly right. It is a comprehensive mind change, policy change, so many changes at different levels that needs to happen all at the same time, hopefully. Professor Guan, to you, this is a transition process in which we already see the quote-unquote energy crisis worldwide. In China, we have also seen issues about electricity shortage, quote-unquote. How do you see we are making that transition, particularly how that transition is going to be discussed in Glasgow?
Well, a couple points I want to make. Such transition is not easy. It's just like China make the emission neutrality goals from peak to neutrality is only 30 years. That will take, if UK, Europe, and US deliver, that will usually between 45 to 70 years. And China is actually reduced the emission twice of the above the US total to zero by using half of the time almost. So so this is never gonna be easy. But we're gonna take this as an opportunity to transit our economy, change the engine from the low carbon driven economy to do that. Second thing, very briefly, I want to talk is. In the previous COPs, I know the government's role is very important, but it's a time to let the business to play, especially many multinational enterprises. They own lots of the IPRs and lots of the climate-friendly IPRs, and then maybe this is some sort of donations or free sharing need to be made. And the business should take a leadership role rather than the government should just be supervision and guidance. The business is the real key to drive the whole economy become a carbon neutral.
I would love to continue this conversation with both of you. It's fascinating discussion. Thank you for putting out straightforward your ideas and insights. I really appreciate that. Only discussions and debates will lead us to some real action. So John Sturman, Guan Dabo, really appreciate it. All the best. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Have a great weekend.